All right, welcome back. So we were just talking about population growth and kind of the effects of population growth. But we're moving on to the second part of the lecture, which is what causes human population growth. And then so there's kind of two things that cause population growth. One is demographics, and a demographic is first and foremost a vocabulary word that you need to know. But the definition of it, a demographic is any kind of statistic about people. And so this is like what our census collects. Um, as far as growth goes, the demographics that we are interested in, and we're going to go into more detail, but the demographics we're interested in are fertility, mortality, and life expectancy. Outside of demographics and kind of those three demographics in specific, there's culture, which also influences human population growth, and we'll talk about that at the very end. So, of the demographics, the first one we're going to discuss is fertility, and fertility is simply the physical ability to reproduce. And so what we find is that humans become fertile right after puberty, so in their teenage years. Women are fertile through about 40 or 50 years of age, and then they go through menopause. They are no longer physically able to have children. However, men are fertile throughout their whole lives. The demographic that we are specifically interested in is total fertility rate, which is the average number of children born to an average woman in a population during her lifetime. And so the total fertility rate actually varies from country to country. And so I want you to take a second, pause the video, and make a little prediction. Do you think the U.S. would have a higher, lower, or equal fertility rate to a third world country, say in sub-Saharan Africa? And so again, the question is, do you think the U.S. overall would have a higher, lower, or equal total fertility rate to a third world country such as sub-Saharan Africa? All right, you can pause the video now, think about your answer. And the answer is that the U.S. actually has a lower fertility rate than third world countries, and we're going to talk about that more here in just a second. There are three big things that affect fertility rates in an area. First and foremost is the number of women in that area that are physically able to reproduce. So they have reached maturity and they're within that range of the teens to 40 or 50. Secondly, nutrition is really important. If women do not have proper nutrition, then they cannot carry babies, and those babies don't come to term. Either they do not ovulate, or the child doesn't receive enough nutrition and doesn't make it all the way through to birth. And then lastly is education and opportunities for women. And so what we see in an area is that as women have access to things like education and careers, fertility rates actually go down. It's not that education and jobs for women make them any less physically able to have kids, but those kinds of opportunities influence their choice to have kids. And so those do affect fertility rates in an area. This is a really great example of the overall birth rates that are declining worldwide. And so up at the top here, you see that our least developed countries have the highest birth rate. And so there's an average of almost 7 children born per woman in a very, very lowly developed country. So this is like our third world countries. In less developed countries, you see that number is creeping down. The world overall has an average of 5 children per woman. And then for places like the United States and Europe, which are more developed than most of the world, we see an even lower birth rate. And so as affluency increases, as wealth increases, birth rates generally tend to decrease. In the U.S., we've got an average birth rate of about 2.5 children per woman per her lifetime. Overall, though, over the years, this graph starts in 1950, over the years, and we're about right here, birth rate in all countries is declining. And so this is an interesting thing. We don't see it going to zero. It's not that people aren't having any kids, but the kind of overall world value is projected to even out right at about 2.5. 2.5 children per woman per year. Or, I'm sorry, per her lifetime. The other major factor that we see influences fertility rates in a country is the education of the women in that country. And so the graph on the left indicates a percentage of women who are enrolled in secondary school, which is like middle and high school. And over on the right, we've got the total fertility rate of those women. And so a great example is Ethiopia, which has about 5% enrollment of the women in that country. About 5% of them are in secondary school. And they actually have a total fertility rate of almost 7 children per woman. Um, when we move down and we see other countries like Egypt and South Africa, Jamaica and Colombia, where we've got these higher rates of education. South Africa almost has 100% of women in secondary schools. That birth rate declines significantly to about 3 children per woman. And so there's a direct relationship between educational opportunities for women and their choice to have children. The next thing among our demographics, so we've got fertility, which is the birth rate. We also have mortality rates, and a mortality rate is simply the death rate. And so this is how quickly people are dying in an area. This is given as the number of deaths per 1,000 people per year. And what I want to note that's really interesting is that overall, mortality rates are the primary cause of our increase in population growth over the last 300 years. And so that graph I showed you initially with human population increasing exponentially, it's not because we're having more kids, it's because we're not dying. Um, People simply are living longer, our health is better, our technologies are better, and because of that, the global population has increased exponentially. It's a huge factor. And so knowing that mortality rate is the single like biggest or greatest, it's the primary cause of population growth in the last 300 years. There's a few things though, and kind of funny things that can affect mortality rate. Um, and the first one is a youthful population. And so in developing countries, what we see is that most of the population is young and vibrant and doing well. And there's very, very few old people in that population. And so when I do the mortality rate of that population, those types of countries actually have really low mortality rates because I've got very few people dying per how many people are in the country total. On the other end of that, we've got things like the United States, which have a very high mortality rate because we've got a bulk of our people are older, right? We've got a smaller population that's younger, and so we have a higher rate of people dying in the US when we compare it to the total population. The other thing that affects mortality rates is life expectancy. And so the average age at death used to be, and for most of history, has been about 35 to 40 years old. And so in that human population curve, where that line was relatively flat, 35 and 40 made you really old. It made you an elderly person. But today, our life expectancy has increased to almost 70 years of age. And so you can see how that can certainly affect the world population, right? Women are able to produce definitely within this 35 to 40 range. And now they've got the ability to take full advantage of that reproductive range. The last thing that I want to mention about mortality is that life expectancy in an industrial or in a developed country is always much, much higher than in a developing or third world country. And so in an industrial country or developed country, we have a lot of technologies that are able to increase life expectancy, modern medicine, access to hospitals, nutrition, and a lot of social services that allow life expectancy to be increased. In third world countries, those services are not there, and so the life expectancy is a little bit lower. However, for both sets of countries, the life expectancy is increasing at a pretty steady rate. Overall, we consider both fertility and mortality together, and so the total population growth of an area is equal to the birth rate minus the death rate. And you can think of it as like people coming into this world and people leaving this world is ultimately going to be the rate of growth of our population. we do have this thing called a zero population growth model, and that is when we've got a country, and I'm going to draw a little circular country here, right? I've got people being born into that country, and I've actually also got people immigrating to that country, and so we have to consider that when we're looking at a very specific region. And so I do the birth rate plus the number of immigrants coming to that country. And when that exactly equals the number of people dying in that country, then we experience zero growth rate. This does happen in some countries, not in many. And in some countries, we actually even have a negative growth rate. And we're going to talk more about that here in a second. And so these graphs are in your book. They're very interesting graphs, but they're also very difficult to read. And so this is an example of a place with a positive population growth. This is an example of a place with zero population growth. And this is an example of a place with negative population growth. The blue represents male and the red represents female, and we've got age categories starting from 0 down here at the bottom to 90 years old way up here at the top. And so a place with positive population growth, we find that most of the individuals in that population are very young and fall in that reproductive range, and there's very, very few older people in that population. In a stable population growth or a zero population growth, we find that I've got pretty much the same number of people in each of these age categories, right? And so I've got pretty much the same number of people in the very, very young, the reproductive years, as well as the senior years, and that's a very stable population. A declining population is a little bit different, and so I still have very few people that get very, very old, above the average life expectancy. And what I see is I've got a bulge of people here, and so these people are kind of at the end of their reproductive viability, and they're entering their senior years. And so when the bulk of my population is occurring past their reproductive prime, then what I see is a negative population growth in that country overall. And so we in the United States are actually in a negative population growth because of this thing called the baby boom. And you might have heard of baby boomers, and that's people that are born between this time range, between 1946 and 1964. This time was right after World War II, and soldiers were coming back to the States, and they were very happy to see their wives. And so there were a lot of babies born in that time. And after World War II, what we see was a huge increase in fertility in the United States as well as in other countries that led to kind of this bulge that we're talking about. And initially, it was a bulge like this. We were experiencing population growth. But as those baby boomers age, right, that bulge of population kind of moves up past their reproductive prime, and we're experiencing negative population growth. Because after this kind of boom and this happiness to see your wife, the birth rates return to normal. And so we've got this really large group of people that are getting older. And so what we see is, when they were born, we had lots and lots of young people. However, what we're experiencing is what we call a demographic shift, where the bulge in that population is moving towards us having a lot of older people, and in fact, the exact opposite of what it used to be. We used to have more younger people than older people, but because those people are aging, then we now have more older people than younger people. This causes some really interesting social things, because not only do we have to physically take care of our aging population, we also have to financially take care of our aging population. And so when you hear people talk about Social Security and things like that, it does have to do with that negative population growth and us having to care for and humanely care for that aging population, even though there are less younger people who are capable of doing that.